Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to A.I.R or Artificial Intelligence Research. Here I am today with Mr. Xu, someone who works in artificial intelligence. Before we start, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, I think the I started actually not working in the computer science. I work on the biology and the biochemistry for a long time, and I did my graduate study also actually work on bacteriophage for a long time. And by the time when I was about to graduate, I think the sequencing technology began to develop. So I began to work on, as a matter of fact, bacteriophage genomes. And we began to analyze those genomes and it became very interesting that. And so gradually I get into a field called bioinformatics. That's the before the human kind of like right about the time when the human genome sequencing is trying to get hot and everybody began to do the genome sequence analysis. After graduation, I joined the consumer product company and working on the area of the bioinformatics for a long time. And most recently, I began to working more in the field called, I think is more in the machine learning. I would think this is kind of like a vague definition of artificial intelligence. But most of my work is in the area of machine learning. Um,
Uh,
Apply the modern techniques as um, deep learning for the image and the sequence analysis.
wow, sounds like you have a lot of experience. Also, I noticed your previous career sounds a lot similar to my dad, actually.
Yes, yes, that and close friends.
So anyway, that's great. So you have a lot of prior experience with artificial intelligence. Did you take any classes on it, or what other experience do you have?
Yeah, I think the at the time when I was in the while I was doing my PhD, just like your dad, I mean just to in order to better prepare to doing this kind of like a genome sequence analysis, is we do definitely need a computer science background and or programming and data structure and algorithms. So I get a master degree in information science at the same time. But I would say this covered is quite superficial in terms like really prepare you get deeper into the artificial intelligence. So mostly I think you learn as you go. I think as you know, the really the kind of like a recently the so-called artificial intelligence revolution come from the like around the 2010-ish. That's when the deep learning get kind of like become much more popular. So most of those you essentially learn as you go, riding the wave. And as the paper come out and you learn new things, you experiment new things at the time this actually now the modern kind of like AI framework such as TensorFlow, like the PyTorch is even developed. So we started a kind of like a really trying to kind of like learn as you go. You basically see what's developed in what has been developed, and you read the papers, and then you begin to read the books and trying to understand what is needed. And so you have to do a lot of new learning in the process.
Right. So a lot of viewers may not know what machine learning or deep learning is. So could you explain for us?
Yeah, the I think machine learning, in a way, it is basically you trying to fit a function. Once you give this is quite abstract, but just to give you example. So a lot of the techniques, kind of like people take it granted. I mean, the tools. For example, you use your smartphone to recognize kind of like an object to similarity search, and when you're trying to kind of like talk to your phone, they understand you. So those are actually what's driven this once many years ago. It's quite magical. It's very hard to do, but it is because of the development of this machine learning techniques that make it easier. So in a simple kind of like example, say if you're trying to teach machine to recognize dog and a cat, what do? You give it a lot of examples. You collect a lot of examples like internet images of the dog and the cat. And now you're trying to basically let the model feed a model. I mean, feed a kind let it kind of like a computer feed a model. And this model has a lot of parameters. And then you just adjust those parameters little by little. Eventually, when you feed the kind of like model a dog picture, it will output a dog. When you feed a model a cat picture, it will output a cat. Essentially, in the process, you can see, in the process of adjusting those parameters, you can see the model learn something. Essentially, in a kind of like a superficial way, it's feeding a function, really kind of like a big function. So this function has many kind of forms. So most recently, this kind of like a black box function takes a form of called artificial neural networks. So it has kind of like essentially it's sort of trying to mimic what the brain trying to do, but in a really loosely defined way. You kind of like in this artificial neural network, you have nodes that kind of like the neurons. It takes input and it computer output. When you have lots of these collections, it form a neural network. And when you get many layers of them, they call it a kind of like a deep neural network. So essentially, is this development this kind of like a really large scale neural networks and the techniques to feeding these neural networks made this kind of like or you call it recently kind of like a deep learning artificial intelligence revolution. This for somehow I don't think is completely understood. It works really well when you feed it large amount of data.
I see. So machine learning is sort of just taking a bunch of examples and letting the machine learn from it.
Yeah, that's the simple explanation. So you just give it a lot of examples. That's one kind of like one part, I think the really important part of the machine learning. So it's called a supervised learning. You give it labels, you give it examples, and it learn from the. In fact, recently the biggest development is in the kind of like a field called self-supervised learning, because produce the labels is expensive. So you typically it is done by kind of like you have people look at it. Say in the early example I give to you, you give them a lot of dog and a cat, and who give you the labels dog and cat first is the humans, right?
Yeah.
Humans label them. So you give it a lot of examples. Those examples can be expensive to collect. And when you apply to the like the machine learning, I mean, in the medical field, you need basically a lot of times you need doctors or trained, highly trained personnel to collect those labels. Those labels become very kind of like challenging to collect, and the people have been working on techniques. Sometimes it's just to say, can you learn without kind of like this kind of like a tedious labeling process? And people are making progress on that. Essentially, you can give it a large amount of data. And what the model does is trying to find some self-consistency in the data, and in the process, actually learn quite a bit of the kind of like from data. And in a lot in there actually begin and sometimes exceeding the performance when you using the so-called supervised learning in which you basically give it a lot of real examples.
I've seen a couple of YouTube videos where people would use AI, but they'd have to like label everything themselves, and it looked really tedious. Like they had to like put a box around like certain things a million times and like label them. So it does look really time
Yeah,
consuming.
exactly. You see this people doing the self-driving car, and you need to basically taking the video stream and you label everything, where is the pedestrians, where is the road. And so those are the labeling factors that many companies, their business model is just doing the labeling, both in the medical field as well as for the kind of like a regular internet companies for recognize kind of like, let's say, the people objects.
So basically, AI relies a lot on data, right? So where does this data or I guess information usually come from?
Yeah, I think you are exactly right. I think one of the thing make the current AI works is data, and in fact, the I think that many of the algorithms, including what I just talked about, deep neural networks, the idea is not new. It has been there many years. What really make it work is the I think the larger amount of data is one essential ingredient. So lots of this data, to come back to your question, lots of this data has come from, in the start, come from the, because rising of the internet. So people begin to
Mm,
post a lot of stuff, and then you get to can collect a lot of images, text, audios from the internet. And in fact, one of the kind of like, you would say, one of the kind of like really initialization point or the starting point of this kind of like AI revolution is the image recognition. As I mentioned to you, recognize this dog and a cat, or in this case, people from the Stanford, the 50 Lee's group from Stanford, they organized a competition called ImageNet. In fact, you collect millions of images from the internet, and they manually put them into about 1,000 categories, and then you're trying to develop a model to tear them apart. So definitely a lot of data. I mean, they come from the internet as well as the in the biological domain. They come from like a lot of the genome sequencing I mentioned, and you have a lot of genotyping that is trying to get the people's kind of like what's their genome looks like, what are the change differences from different people. So all those are kinds of data can be fed into the machine learning models. You definitely see lots of YouTube's, Twitter posts, and a lot of blogs. All of those can be data feed into the machine learning models.
I see. So would you consider, I guess, so one of the benefits of having this data and like learning from it is how effective, I guess, it is, but also I guess is one of the drawbacks. One of the drawbacks would be if the data is flawed, then the AI learning from it would also be flawed.
I Yeah, that's a one important, really important kind of like people have to know. So the machine really knows nothing about what it has been fed. It's so you give it a fraud data, it will output a fraud result.
Yeah.
So this is actually have to be really careful. For example, in the biomedical field, you give it some fraud examples, and they will generate a fraud outcome. So you give it for example, you give it let's say you're trying to train a machine learning model to diagnose the breast cancer. If you just give it one type of images, it's just one type of cancer. It will only learn this one type. And if you give a different type, it may actually completely give you garbage. Uh,
Yeah.
and it actually make the wrong predictions. And also, I think for example, in the regular kind of like internet data, so if you give it a really biased content, and it can be the machine learning model if you can really become a racist just because you feed into the data that is has of the all this kind of like a racist kind of like speeches or all those. So trying to make sure the data you feed it into the model, it is kind of like good. It's very important for the model. Of course, researchers spend a lot of time trying to because it's very hard to get really clean data from the internet, especially trying to get it from the internet. You're trying to so researchers are trying to develop a lot of methods, trying to at least trying to debiasing some of them, but it's a challenging problem.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories actually of AIs having certain biases, and I think one of the more like common biased areas is facial recognition actually, because that's like a kind of artificial intelligence. So taking these biases in account, do you think that facial recognition software should be used for security purposes? Is it like an invasion of privacy? Is AI in general, like using data, is that an invasion of privacy? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think it use AI in general is kind of like a invasion of privacy. It really depends on how you use the data, right? If you're trying to, for example, there's a lot of uh, uproar or debate. If you, for example, people are trying to use people's face, trying to kind of like predict whether this person going to be a criminal or not,
Oh,
right? That's going to be really, really bad.
yeah.
Like you could put lots of innocent people in the jail even before they did anything wrong. Uh, but it can be used for a lot of good purposes. It can make you really convenient. For example, if you, let's say you go into, you go into a building, the building is kind of like normally only allows kind of like, let's say, employee to go in. And now you do not have to swipe your badge, you can get in. But if your employer begin to kind of like use this in kind of like a more intrusive way, that can be really bad. So this is always a subtle line and a lot of debate. This have to be done really carefully. I think do not allow this kind of like um, uh, art to kind of like use it kind of like in a way that follow some strict ethic guidelines. There's lots of the story on the along those lines. So people build the tools to predict whether uh, kind of like how they should be treated, and it turns out it's kind of like they use, for example, zip code information. Treated means like going to the hospital, right? When you the doctor when you prescribe treatment, and then when you use the kind of like a demographic information, you can get use people's zip code, and it turns out this zip code is correlated with the, for example, the ethnicity, and you can actually begin to really make this kind of like a bad decisions
Yeah.
using this flawed biased information.
Okay, so what do you think then? Actually, this is kind of a little unrelated, but what do you think uh people misunderstand about AI? Because
I would say that in lots of so in it depends on kind of like which audience you talk about, right? There's definitely lots of hypes about AI right now. I think that in a way, I think at least in my point of view, we are still very far from something called a general artificial intelligence. As the lots of the AI is still in the states, just as we talked earlier, feeding the data. And it's basically still garbage in, garbage out. They made a lot of tremendous progresses in a lot of areas. But I think the hype that they will when it will begin to kind of like uh, do everything and replace human, kind of like I think it's still pretty mature. I do think that the task by task, it will get there, but it is not there yet.
I see. In that case, if there's any advice or I guess, yeah, advice or something you wish would happen in the development of AI, is there anything you could think of that you think would help in developing AI?
Um, I think that definitely, I mean, um, in I think this is a very general question. Like if you talk the society effect, or you talk about, I think, for example, it depends on the area of application. It could be the quite different. So
Uh,
I would talk about more in this case in the domain I have been working on, in the biological domain and the medical domain, in terms like how I would like to think it would help the AI development. In this case, is the again related with what we talked earlier. Collect the data, and so lots of the data, for example, in the hospitals, the data is collected in a way that is making it very difficult to access, make it very difficult to kind of like integrate from hospital to hospital. So if you have if in the future, especially in the medical AI, people were able to kind of like easily get this data collected, integrated, and of course, be mindful of all the privacy informations. And that will be really kind of like I think revolutionize medical AI, because data is the fuel. So you if you can have collect a larger amount of this data, they will significantly improve, I think, this field, because you will now be able to use this data to build really complex models, track how the patient responded to each kind of like treatment.
yeah, it's really cool seeing how far AI could go in terms of helping people. And on that topic, I guess, what do you think the best part and worst part of AI is? Or yeah, originally it was just gonna be best part, but on that topic anyway, we're gonna talk about the worst, I guess, too.
Yeah, the best part is to be honest, I think it is just a lot of way, even though mathematically speaking, it is, as we talk about, fitting some function, but the result is magical. I think it is definitely helping all over the society. I mean, from my point of view, I will only, let's say, talk about the research. It definitely, from the, like, say, when many years ago, when you do the search, when you're trying to find literature, you have to go to a library, look at the card references, and you have a kind of like a small database search for kind of like an abstract. Now you almost Google replaced the searching everything, and you can do the image search. You can now use this images kind of like help people do the diagnostics, and hopefully enable people find the kind of like a treatment earlier. That's definitely a lot of the good things. I mean, just as we talked about the recognized images, it's easy for human because human has a large portion of the brain dedicated for that, but it has been extremely difficult for machine for many years. So the development of this has been make it definitely much easier now. And so essentially, it's not just helping our daily lives. I mean, anytime you use Google, anytime you talk to your phone, it is using artificial intelligence to make the life much easier, make things much more efficient. But it also helping lots in the research area. So I mean, the we are certainly benefited greatly from kind of like the information retrieval part of the artificial intelligence. Uh, Definitely, there's a lot of could be, if not being careful, bad things can happen. And for example, people are using it, let's say, using the AI. Again, the ability to recognize things as a kind of like a recognize images that begin to develop, let's say, used into the weaponry, develop weapons trying to kill people. All the biases you put into the model without being too careful, and then you result in people mistreated or sometimes result into death. That can be really death. And I think also perpetuated a bias in the society. I mean, speaking kind of like a more general term, so people use the Facebook and use the Twitter, you can quickly get how toxic things can become. Partly that is because there's a recommendation system behind this kind of like platforms. They trying to reinforce people's view and then trying to kind of like become an echo chamber. And so you get a lot of kind of like people uh, reinforce their kind of like a biased view. And I think that's kind of detrimental to the society.
Yeah. When AI is when there's so many possibilities, I guess always going to be good and bad. Um, uh, I want to ask you specifically, like, what's one thing that you hope is developed in artificial intelligence? Like, what's one way that you want it to be, one impact that you want it to have in any topic, like anything in the world? What do you want it to improve?
You mean the algorithm part, or is in just say in general AI, uh, what aspect it can be improved?
Um, I meant like in the world, what sort of world issue do you want AI to solve?
Oh, I think this is, I mean, I would say several issues, many issues. But you can, from the bigger point of view, you can think, solve the, let's say, the climate change. That's one thing. Say, how do you kind of like devise new strategies to kind of like, I mean, we are currently definitely has a lot of problems for the climate change this summer. People experience probably extreme heat. I suspect that's going to become more common. So can we develop a new kind of like energy resources using AI to help this develop much faster so we can get ourselves out of this carbon kind of like a fossil fuel based technology and then develop better method to capture the carbon so that we can make our kind of like a planet sustainable hopefully many years in the future. That's definitely, I think, the one thing that hopefully can help. On the other hand, I think come back to what I'm doing. I think that I do genuinely hope because uh, that's part of the reason I dedicated myself doing this. AI can help better treat the treatment of disease. I think they invent new medicines that was not possible before. So that I mean, definitely make people become healthier.
Yeah, I'm also gonna looking into the medical field is very inspiring, I guess, to see how uh the future could be helped by AI. Are you excited for the future of artificial intelligence?
Yes, I'm excited. Really excited. I think I think it has lots of potential. We are just scratch the surface. Again, a lot of the one we are doing is again we taking just feeding the examples to the machine and let the machine begin to kind of learn from the examples. And even that, it kind of like already has been tremendously helpful for the research. I think that as the future goes, the data collection will become much easier, and our computational power going to become much more powerful. So you can even feed bigger and bigger models, and so those predictions are going to become more accurate. So really, I think it's an exciting field to get into now.
What is your favorite or least favorite part of working in artificial intelligence, would you say?
Um, The favorite part is definitely sometimes again, as I mentioned earlier, it feels magical. You can say suddenly
Yeah.
something begin to, oh, whoa, really? It can learn doing this. Just to give you an example, I think you know the recent breakthrough by the AlphaFold 2 by DeepMind. In fact, they were able to use a machine learning model to predict the protein structures, which if
Whoa,
you
that's cool.
if you work in the field, you will feel really magical how they actually can do it. So there's a lot of kind of like magical moments. Just because you would think it's very challenging and you'll never figure out how to do it, and then it works. So that's feel very satisfactory in that case. The worst part of the the whole thing is that come back to again come back to our earlier. These models require large amount of data as well as large amount of computation. So lots of times the data is in a format that is not ready to directly feed into the model. So you spend a lot of time to clean up the format and clean up the data. And in fact, there's some saying in the field which I think mostly it's actually true. So for machine learning researcher, you probably spend 80% of the time just to clean up the data, 20% of the time to develop the models. Definitely clean up the data is not the most kind of like a satisfactory experience, and you because a lot of this data come from human curations. They make the mistakes human did not even recognize. For example, you have case people put a kind of like in the same field they use the, let's say, change in cases. Uppercase versus lowercase is replace the spaces. Sometimes they replace the spaces with dashes. And in worst cases, they replace zero versus O. And so human probably cannot tell that readily, but you have to, the machine can basically think they are just different. So you spend a lot of time to clean the data. That's definitely very can be boring.
Yeah, I can understand that. Okay, so similar, I guess, to what you enjoy about working in AI. Are there any moments in your life where AI has helped you or harmed you? I guess like memorable moments that you think were noteworthy.
um, Let me think about it. Because again, we have been using this kind of like machine learning model for many years. I think uh, in one part, in one particular work I have worked on, that's really in the early stage of the kind of like the deep learning. And we will begin to feed in models to predict the age of a person. I think at the time it is kind of like uh, because traditional age prediction, people take a lot of manually created features from the face and then you feed the model. When we begin to train a model that just taking the raw kind of like face images directly predict the age, that's really magical to me at the time. That's, I mean, really early in the time when before this all this kind of like deep learning frameworks and when it begin to work, and that's really feels magical, and that's kind of like really sparked my further interest in trying to kind of like apply this kind of model to many other problems.
Ah, that's cool. Although my question was, I guess, well, my question was more like, how do you use AI in your daily life, actually?
Okay. In the daily life, I think that again, we first kind of like just like any other research problems, you define a research problem. So this is a particular problem you want to solve. And then we begin to kind of like collect data and then training the models. Begin to kind of like clean up the data and feeding the models. And I think from time to time, and not happen just like any research because it's research. Many times it will end up in failure, and in the sometime it actually works and it was great. So that's actually this quite a few this moments. I would say. Uh, I think the again the when you can sometimes I think the probably cannot disclose it is when you feed a model you think it's not can it I mean it probably has a little chance for it to work and it works beautifully and that's kind of like a again magical part of the make you feel really satisfactory, make you feel that the time you spend on others collecting and cleaning up the data is not wasted. Um,
Do you think that as AI advances, that they'll replace our jobs?
I think it's already happening. Some job will be replaced, some job will be created. So you will see in lots of this job. I would say it's the ones the job that can be readily defined. That is, you can write a kind of like a specific what this job involves. Those are the types of jobs can probably be eventually replaced. But there's more jobs that will require you kind of like is much fuzzier, not well defined, like doing research, and it takes a kind of like a lot of kind of like prior knowledge and a lot of kind of like underlying reasoning and to kind of like do your job. Those are the kind of the things a little bit challenging and to be replaced. But I think gradually it probably first become an assistant to so that you can use AI to help you doing better, and gradually it will replace. More and more will be job will be replaced, and but again at the same time it'll probably create some other types of works, just like the color like in previous the industrial revolution. So you replaced a lot of agriculture jobs, but you also create lots of additional jobs. Similar things hopefully will happen this time as well. Not everybody gonna just go out of job.
Yeah. I've actually seen a lot of AI art on social media. It's very cool seeing it, I guess, and how it's actually made. Although I've noticed there are certain qualities that sort of distinguish it from actual like artists made art. Do you think AI art is like comparable to real art? Could it even replace actual artists, do you think?
I think this is also depends on what type of art, right? The this type of art is you can see this. I mean, these are really what you talk about is really kind of like when you see it is really magical. To me, when you just say, for example, recently the OpenAI released the DALL-E 2, and then the I mean, and Google released the Imagine. So all of this you can just tell it speak a sentence and it will generate lots of kind of like a really realistic art. So in a way, they will replace it will play a kind of like a I think it will become a thing as a computer generated art because they are quite special and quite sometimes looks quite magical as well. But I don't think it will replace the kind of like every person's I mean the traditional artist because in my view in the traditional art is not just art, it also encompasses the artist's own experience, the
Yeah.
view of the society. So those are the I mean how he so it's hard to have an AI has the same grow up experience as an artist, has the same view as the artist has or his emotion at the time. So all those kind of like subtle things, it will be very challenging to replace. I think, in fact, I think probably the art will still continue. It will probably evolve, become to say computer generated art will become a thing. It'll probably become much more kind of like permeated in the society as just general art. You maybe have exhibitions about a computer generated art. I think this probably already are. Uh, but I think it's just art is still irreplaceable.
Yeah. So there's a certain human quality, I guess, that AI can't replicate. So is it safe to say that AI will never be truly sentient? Or what's your opinion on sentience in
Huh.
AI?
Um, I think that in a way, to me, this is a very interesting part. It has a lot of debate. In a way, you have to define the sentient, what that means. All right.
Yeah.
Recently, you probably read the news, and then there's a Google employee talk to the chatbot, a Google chatbot, and begin to because the chatbot, when you ask the question, it give you some responses, and then sometimes when you ask a question, it seems like the chatbot is deeply emotional. So you can think it becomes sentient, but it is not. It is mostly still trained using the same method as we talked. You give it the input, it output, it begin give it some input, it generate the output. It is you know exactly what's the parameter in those, and it is just still just a function parameterized with some parameters. But again, it's not because we lack of a precise definition of what is sentient. Uh, that's maybe people may argue your brain it is a kind of like a black box function with some parameters. Those parameters may be how your neurons connected. So this is definitely going to be quite a bit debate to me, but debate in the future. But to me, I don't think AI is sentient yet. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, actually, the talk about or the discussion of what sentient actually means philosophically, we my previous interview, we also had to clarify that. So anyway, moving on. Um, in that case, well, how about do you think that AI could ever rule the world one day or take over humans?
uh, I think that that's probably still not happening at least in the near future. I think it just depends on how it will be it'll be hard to see never to ever because in the future depends on how people are utilizing this powerful technology and I would not say AI rule the world. It's probably will running a significant part of the society. Running means, for example, it's the let's say optimize a lot of the our daily lives. Uh, but it's the as a kind of like in this sci-fi movies as the ruler of the earth. I think probably not.
Yeah. Okay, so almost finished, I suppose. Uh I okay, so you mentioned those chatbots actually. If an AI, if in the future there are like AI, maybe even robots that walk around, um, would you be friends with them? Would you even consider starting a romantic relationship with one?
uh, I think they could potentially be friends, but it's hard to see a romantic relationships. But they can be friends or they can be half the. I mean, you could potentially definitely use that for example, doing lots of good take of elderly elders, and then let's say clean up the streets and have to kind of like. Let's say, maintain the orders in public places. So I think that
Yeah.
these things will be happening, especially for this kind of like dangerous jobs that is too dangerous for human. And then once you get a AI that is really intelligent, and has a lot of the flexibility and the mobility as a human, they can begin to doing lots of this kind of like a more tedious, dangerous jobs and helps human. I mean, helps to relieve human from doing that, and so human can enjoy the life better.
Yeah. Um, okay, so that's basically all I have for today, and I don't want to take too much of your time anyway. So, last question, I guess, is are there any questions you wanted me to ask you or anything you want to say right now to like the viewers or to me? Any questions or answers?
Yeah, I think the depends on kind of like the viewer you had. I think it is the really I think the uh, one thing is that if you want to learn more about this is really the a lot of the kind of like the mainstream, I mean the media is definitely not the best place to get the I think just probably as you do read a little bit more in the um, let's say just trying to dig deeper yourself, learn what is really underlying the AI, especially those tools to build this kind of like to models are become really accessible. So in a lot of ways, it's like building Lego. Once you can begin to experimenting to kind of like put those modules. If you are adventurous, again, depends on your audience. Let's say if your audience is aspiring high school kids, and you can begin to experimenting yourself. There's all those tools available. You do not even need to have a big computer yourself. You can use tools like the Google provided, the Colab, and begin to experimenting and do yourself and learn yourself, and then you will have a much better kind of like develop your own perspective. What is this really about? There's a lot of resource on the internet, lots of books, lots of really, really good lectures from the kind of like internet. I mean, like Andrew Ng's machine learning courses. You can begin to take those courses and learn from it, and soon you will have much better understanding what's going on.
I see. Yeah, that's a good advice. Okay. Uh, I guess that'll end it. So, thank you so much for agreeing to do this, and thanks for your time. I learned a lot today, and I know the viewers did, um, as well. So,
Yeah.
thank you. This will end the recording.